co-founder and co-convener of the Motlanthe Drakensberg Inclusive Economic Forum. And it is at this conference where I got to experience the mystery, the generosity, the questioning, the magnificence of William's mind, heart, and being. He has chaired a number of public organization boards. And just to say that he's also involved in public newspapers around the world. And for you, if you want to find more about how he thinks and feels and you want to support his work, he is author of a couple of first bestsellers, but his most recent book, South Africa in BRICS, you're welcome to buy it. So you can hear that it is my joy to introduce Professor William Gumede. What I love and appreciate about him is he's an academic, a public intellectual, and a social justice actor. He is fearless in venturing into unknown terrain, bending his mind and being to seek understanding of the very vulnerabilities of which we are all concerned, so that the dignity of people is restored, that leadership is ethical and exemplary, and that our country can heal from past wounds so that all our people may flourish. For me, he is a master story. For Sister Thobile Gumede, he is kin. And for us all, he is educator, inspirator, and leader on a journey to new ways of perceiving and engaging with our world. William, we are humbled by your agreeing to be with us today and share your current musings, insights, and apprehensions. Thank you.
Okay. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm very happy that you invited me. And it was so fortunate to meet with Dr. Sako. I was just telling her that I've been spending the last couple of days. Can you hear me clearly? Oh, you can. Do I have to speak? Do I have to face? Or are you good? Can you see me? Yeah, everything's fine. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm always myself.
I know you are.
I just wanted to see. So are the platforms where things are good? I mean, if anyone can't hear me, please do kind of just do raise your hand. I once was in a class which I gave, and at the end of the class, you know, as people come and sort of ask extra questions, somebody said to me, "Well, what was your argument?" So I said, were you not in the class?" I said, "Yeah, I couldn't hear you." I said you come to me earlier. But I'm very excited. I mean, I've been spending the last 3 days really actually at a retreat, at meditation retreat. And it's been very exciting because it's a little bit different in that the organizers managed to get a really diverse group of South Africans in one space. And the idea was, how do we motivate people who are out there at the coalface, and how do we keep them hopeful? How do we keep them inspired? I mean, I often get asked, not only here, but also in the region, to speak to people who are really at the coalface, people who are either mediating in violence or working in very difficult spaces to get their sort of morale up. And a couple of years ago, and I used to respond in an intellectual way, and then I backtracked and sort of flipped and decided possibly that sometimes an intellectual response is just not good enough, it's not adequate, and that a spiritual response is most probably more appropriate. And then how does one combine an intellectual response with a spiritual response? So when I say spiritual, which goes across all religions. I mean, I advised a couple of years ago the Central African Republic with they were in a civil war, the Muslims and Christians. And obviously in that kind of advisory capacity, one has to think above specific religion or from that point of view, but how do you make an argument based on a universal spirituality? So I'm increasingly really I've moved from some of the things I have been doing to try to get much more into the sort of space of can one respond with or infuse one's response with more spirituality. So really that's just where I am. And I've increasingly looked very much at trauma and societies in trauma, like whether it's colonial trauma or whether it's trauma from apartheid or trauma from civil war, but also trauma from chronic poverty for a very, very long time. And my sense is that the trauma-based societies, unless they deal with the unprocessed trauma, it impacts on people's decision-making, intimate decision-making, personal decision-making, and even the political leaders they elect and the parties they support. And that is why it is very crucial that one engage in their space, because often people make decisions against their own interests based on the past. So how does one begin to tackle that? So really for me, if there's a purpose in where I am right now and in the future, that is the space which I've been engaging. I set up a foundation specifically to deal with that. I'm very grateful that foundation is now certainly the largest foundation in Africa from this sort of, we in 10 countries. We've been focusing on training a new generation of political leaders, but also bringing people together. For example, in September last year, we managed for the first time in Angola to bring the MPLA government, the top leadership in UNITA together in our offices in Lusaka for 3 days. I mean, it hasn't happened. They haven't seen each other face to face since the Civil War. And we got them to agree on how to conduct themselves ahead of the last year's election. So those are the sort of things we try that we're working on. And I am trying to infuse also in those sort of engagements in our teams. We've just got just under 150 people to bring also a spiritual element, but as I say, sort of a universal one, not necessarily religious, the sort of values that goes across denominations and so on. So that really is the space. So now societies, this is not my speech. I'm getting to my speech now. Societies that emerge from traumatic experiences, as I said, they require leaders that are slightly different. And unfortunately, if you look at African post-colonial history since the Second World War, and I'm just going to do a little bit of ads for myself. I'm coming out with a book on a long history of Africa since 1945, later this year. And I looked at every country. It's taken me about 15 odd years to get it done. But what comes out of it is that what we need on the continent and in South Africa also, and I'm going to try to talk also not just about South Africa, but just really the region also because we're so interrelated and interlinked, We need leaders really that offers hope and that emphasize forgiveness and they govern in the widest interest of everyone. So governing beyond their own political parties and beyond their own ethnic groups and their own color and their own religion and so on. So in all kinds of societies, it's leadership is at a higher premium. So almost a higher standard of leadership is required in our societies. And we just think about this. I mean, if you in the US now, there's some bad leaders like Trump and so on. But those societies, their fundamentals are so strong that they can recover very quickly from bad leaders. I mean, the institutions are very strong. The web of institutions of society cultures and the values are so strong, and those societies they really can pretty much rebound very quickly. In our kinds of societies, once we have the likes of, say, Jacob Zuma and so on, it will take years to recover. So leadership is really at a premium, but it's a certain kind of leadership which is crucial, because these societies, because we're so ethnically diverse, we've got a past which is contested, and we live the past in the present, and sadly also we often live the future also in the past. And it is why so critical in our kinds of societies that we don't live in the past. That we get the kind of leaders with the imagination, not to be stuck in the past, to be able to imagine the future, but to be in the present and make decisions in the present rather than based on the past. It's an absolutely critical requirement. And obviously in our societies, with its high levels of inequality that's based on the past, and also where the democratic rules and the institutions and the democratic governance are not fully embraced by all. I mean, that's our problem. I'm just to digress. I mean, although our democratic constitution is our pinnacle set of rules for all of society, it is contested. There are parallel governance systems in our society, which actually is in many cases above our constitution, stronger than our constitution. Just an example. I mean, we've got, for example, customary law in our country in the rural areas, where traditional leaders and authorities are really powerful and where there is the law. So if the constitution says gender equality, there's no gender equality in parts of our society. I mean, in fact, possibly in the majority parts of our society. So that is a parallel system, governance system. You can take it in other African countries also, I mean, in some places you get Sharia law, for example. In a third of African countries, the informal law is Sharia law. So so even if a country has a constitution and constitutional norms, other, they contesting norms in society. So how do we engage with that? And how do we deal with that in an imaginative way? And so on. So this is just one example. I mean, there's other parts of our country, sadly, I mean, a couple of years ago, or even before I start. So in the 80s, I started off initially in the advice office movement. I started working initially from 86 onwards with gangs on the Cape Flats, and in the negotiation between gangs. As part of the advice officers. So the gangs in the old crossroads area, Payalicha, and it's Langa, and then Mitchell's Plain. So that's those sort of areas. And 10 years ago, I was asked to come and talk to community leaders in the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, and mostly in Durban and in Pietermaritzburg, who's been negotiating with gangs in areas that's dominated by gangs. And so in parts of our country, the governance system of gangs is actually the dominant system, where if you don't defer to the gangs in these townships, your life is worthless. So the Constitution as our supreme document is non-existent in these communities. So that's another example of a parallel system in a country. So obviously in some other countries, so I mean, I'm now I'm advising currently the president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in their civil war, and that civil war involves a couple of other countries also, like Rwanda, Uganda, and so on. So parts of that country really, the militia actually control. The state doesn't have a control over parts of the country. There's no absolutely, I mean, the democratic system, the judiciary, the police have absolutely no say. So I mean, so those kind of societies where, yes, on paper there are institutions, democratic institutions and constitutions, but really the parallel institutions are actually the dominant institutions. So how does one intervene? What does one do? So let me take you through on the individual level. So trauma from colonialism, apartheid, civil war, chronic poverty, what it does, it leaves broken individuals and broken communities and societies. So if societies don't deal with the brokenness, it becomes a legacy, because what happens, it is transmitted over generations. Because I'm just thinking in terms of typically in a family or in a community, the past gets replicated unless it is being dealt with. So the trauma whether it's in parenting, whether it is in behavior in a community, and so on. So I mean, so there was some interesting research in Israel, and I've used quite a lot of that research and try to adapt it really for our context, where that is so that even after 3 generations of the Holocaust, that the offspring almost still behave like their grandparents, despite them having lived a good life. Middle class or upper middle class, they still exhibit almost the same sort of things, the scarcity mentality, hoarding, anxiety, fear of the future, making decisions out of scarcity, out of fear-based rather than out of abundance. Even in choosing of intimate partners, often in a very self-sabotage way, rather than because we want to make decisions with freedom, with abundance, with in happiness. That's how we want to make personal decisions, not in fear, and sort of fear-based and anxiety-based, because that often we get self-sabotage type of decisions. So that's why it is so important in our societies that we try to deal with that. Now, from a political point of view and from a governance point of view, because I saw a line has been on governance and accountability. Now, the thing with unprocessed trauma is that during trauma, and I did a little bit of it, and I'm getting to sense, I did Mandela's the No Easy Walk to Freedom, his introduction to his No Easy Walk to Freedom. And I reflected on it in terms of his leadership versus other leadership outside, well, current leaders, well, the sort of There's the leadership just after him, and then the leadership in the rest of Africa. And the thing about coming out of what trauma does is often it to survive, even as an individual or as a family, you have to make moral compromises to survive. Now, often, so continual moral compromises to survive then becomes a way of doing things. Once the society is stabilized, one almost have to undo it, almost have to unlearn doing things that way. When we see the sort of, if you look at our kind of societies, high levels of corruption, where people do things that you would say, well, doesn't that go against your values? Why did you do that? Why did you take the bribe money? Why did you do that? And often it is generally because to survive during trauma periods, and trauma is also chronic poverty, long unemployment, is that the compromises just to live sort of sometimes damage even the way moral decisions, the survival to feed children becomes more obviously critical. So, and a society then beyond that trauma will really have we almost have to have almost a popular movement to undo, to come to a new moral way of looking at things, new values, which in South Africa we haven't done. We didn't focus. We didn't focus on. I mean, the second thing, just related from a governance point of view, accountability point of view, is just during. I mean, from a trauma-based, short-term thinking becomes the norm. Because societies under trauma, you don't know how long. You don't know if you get tomorrow is actually going to be there. So short-term, and it becomes a culture. Short-term thinking and planning and making decisions on the now becomes really the norm. And one almost has to undo that. One have to say it is safe to make long-term decisions. It is safe because you are going to be there. You're going to be safe for the long term, not survival-based decisions. And often, even from a cultural practices, is often societies that is in that survival mode embrace in cultures which really is harmful to them and leaders that are harmful to them. I mean, I've been involved in it was a very hard one for me in the longest defamation case in the post-apartheid era with Jacob Zuma. When he was the president, and the case only ended in 2018. It was just over 15 years, and it was about Zulu culture in terms of, and I had done a couple of public talks in KZN and a couple of articles around how to reform the aspects of culture that is harmful. That destroys the dignity of individuals, and it is against the Constitution. And some of the parts of our culture that actually has been invented very recently for survival during the apartheid era. So, and so on, and we have to let go. I mean, even things like a sample that we think is fundamental to Zulu culture, but it's not fundamental to it, is the idea of paying a bride for, for your brides, you pay the families. Now, just think about this. What it does is almost an ownership. You marry someone and you pay, and it becomes an ownership. It's almost obviously was not meant to be that. But if we don't have these discussions and look at these sort of practices, which is really deep to our identities, but which actually is harmful to ourselves and perpetuates actually some of the violence that we've seen, the GBV that we're talking about. Because once one has the idea of owning somewhere else, it's we're really in terrifying territory. And so on. So I mean that is just an example. I mean there's many other examples, but it gives you a sense of the sort of territory that we have to engage in, and we have to be open about and public about, and have a dialogue, a robust dialogue around. I was just thinking about, I mean, I'm not obviously not part of the circumcision, because in Zulu culture we don't do circumcision, so I'm not part of that. But in the Eastern Cape and many other cultures, Black cultures in South Africa, circumcision into adulthood is quite important. So young men goes out and spend some time in initiation schools. Now, if you look at the initiation schools, the curriculum, so how to be a man, is that still appropriate for our times? Are the people who teach how to be a man appropriate? Shouldn't we now begin to look at bringing women into the teaching, so that we bring in a less toxic masculinity? Can we bring in vulnerability? The vulnerability is critical part of our humanity, of being what we are, whether we're men or women, that is an important part of it. So we bring in constitutional values at that level also, so that if someone comes out of these sort of rite of passage schools, that there is a constitutional understanding, there's a constitutional values, how to, equality between men and women, that becomes a fundamental thing as part of becoming an adult. And so on. So really those are quite crucial debates that we haven't had with this sort of transparency and maybe with courage, because these are very difficult, because it's fundamental to our identities, and often during trauma periods, these are sort of the things that holds communities together. And so on, and if one wants to break it, well, not break it, reform it and change this, it is almost, people fear that it changes their identities, that really gave them safety during periods of upheaval, but that we have to change now in order to build a healthy societies that we want to build, that we desperately, absolutely desperately want to build. Now, the other thing about in the political sphere, really, and which is increasingly for me become very important research, but only not research, but in public engagement, is how does it influence people's political decision making? How does trauma? Often what people do, they vote for parties of the past that, that they identified with in the past, like struggle parties. So despite the fact that in our present times, the parties may be corrupt and may be incompetent and may be violent, because the past was the safety net. If you, any of the liberation movements, not only here, but also outside in other African countries. And people then stay on with parties that actually, as they continue to vote for these parties that may have been in the past, be in their safety and be their security, this is now in a sort of post-trauma area, is harmful to them, because the parties are corrupt, the parties are incompetent, the parties encourage violence, and so on, but people continue to stay with the party based on the past. So really, in terms of, even if you want to engage, we want to say, well, actually, let's begin to look at holding political parties accountable in the present, not based on the past. It's very, very critical. I mean, I worked on the UNESCO as advisor, not only as advisor, but putting it together, putting the ideas of the framework, how UNESCO should look at the Global Inequality Report that came out in 2016. So we look at all the countries around the world and inequality and our inequality impact in the present on sort of broadly on even in the present in many countries, whether it's India, or so on, or South Africa, and this was a very, very crucial part in that the affinity, what's a trauma-based inequality in the present, what it does is, many people stay with the communal type of parties that they supported before, even if those staying with these parties in the present is really harmful to them. To their interests, and to their children's interests, and to their families' interests, and to the community's interests, and their country's interests. So how does one intervene and change culture around that? Now, societies, I still have 5 more minutes. I think so, yeah. So the thing about societies is that they fall into victimhood very easily. Obviously, often rightly, but most of the time wrongly or inappropriately, blaming the past. I mean, we've seen this in South Africa, blaming apartheid, blaming colonialism. Obviously, I'm not taking the right away from communities to blame the past for the present. But what it does really is that it undermines the agency of individuals and communities. Because if you fall back on blaming enemies of the past or new enemies, you really lose the agency to sit down and plan and come up with policies at present, and to be accountable and to be responsible, take control of your own life, of your own future, be proactive. It fundamentally undermines agency at the individual level, but also the communal level, and even at a society level. But what it does from an accountability point of view, if you are a corrupt governing party, it becomes very easy to deflect, because you can say, well, we didn't do this, we didn't fulfill our promises because it is a party to a white monopoly capital, or it is foreigners who take our resources away. And then the voters that's supposed to hold the parties and leaders accountable sort of accept that. Yes, it is white monopoly capital. Yes, it is a party. Yes, it is African foreigners. So, so it's both on the agency side, but it's also on the accountability side, because it really is important for societies to prosper, to build agency, particularly after trauma, that people must be able, or at least new generation must be able to have that feeling of, I can change my life. I can do it. On the one hand, and also one has to have the accountability that individuals must have the ability to hold people accountable, their leaders, the people that they vote for. Those two things: agency on the one hand, that you know whether it's an individual basis, or a family basis, or a communal basis, that your life, you can actually change your life. It's very important, because once one loses that ability and there's a hopelessness, it's very, very difficult. And then the second one, I say, from accountability, because it's a missing link, is the accountability to the ability when you vote for a party, or an individual, that you hold them accountable, and if they don't deliver, that you vote for someone else. Yeah. So let me conclude. So to conclude, that we may have gone the wrong way, I think, now to rebuild the state and to foster democracy and implement development projects and even to deal with violence. Perhaps what we should have done in 1994, parallel to building the institutions of democracy and the state and so on, what we should have done is to focus perhaps on things like self-love, self-worth, self-esteem. And it's maybe in a way what we sort of linked almost everything, our development projects with self-love. I mean, anything as simple as giving a social grant, that's part of that would be a self-worth, if you even want to have a self-worth course or agency course or a self-love component of it. So almost in every even other kinds of development, whatever development projects and or community empowerment projects that are so key part of these projects. So if we sort of focus much more on those sort of thing, how does one assert agency, that should be part of the mix of development projects and state building self-respect and so on. And that perhaps could be the missing link in all of our projects. And then to conclude, I mean, I have been involved in the state. I mean, I was just part of Ramaphosa inquiry. There's a lot of inquiries. Ramaphosa set up a lot of inquiries and task teams. Obviously, following the recommendations of the inquiries and task teams is a different story. But I was part of the inquiry on the professionalization of the state and how we can restructure the state so that the state can deliver. And and while I was putting these reports together and engaging with the state and so on and making the recommendations, it became clear to me, I realized that possibly could there be an element of the fact that our state has been failing? Could it be also that many of the new people that joined the state were traumatized and didn't deal with their unprocessed trauma? Could they have brought it into the state itself? Even it's very simple, because many of them are quite uncaring as civil servants. Could it just be in that sort of, when I spoke about you're just looking after yourself because it's survival. So despite now being actually a senior civil servant, that you actually you're also uncaring because you only look at your own, your own protection on the one hand. And so that part of restructuring the state should also even be at that level, that we should actually include self-worth even at that level. And secondly, that even in the private sector, that perhaps bringing business into the space of saying, well, even at an employee level, that they actually also get involved in inculcating self-worth and all of the things that an agency is in the workplace as part of the development programs, as the integral part, even in business, because the toxicity of trauma, unprocessed trauma, will also have its impact, obviously, at the levels, even as a private sector. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Gumede. As I said, he's venturing into new ideas. When he stood up at the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation Inclusive Forum, he was closing it. And he says, I think we have to think about love. And I knew that when he came here today, he would have teased out some of those ideas and link it to accountability, to leadership, and to social agency. So thank you so much, Professor Gumede, for sharing your thoughts and your ongoing quest to really understand our society and our humanity. And it's wonderful for us as a Dominican community to hear that you are embracing a spirituality to it so that you can continue the work that you're doing. Thank you very much.
So it is now my pleasure to welcome Father Peter John Pearson, who is the director of the Catholic Parliamentary Office in Cape Town. The Catholic Parliamentary Office is part of the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, and Father Peter John and his team represent the bishops and the church in various portfolio committees, helping to get the church's point of view, the social justice point of view, into the various committees in which they are involved. Father Peter John has been there for an awful long time. I asked him the other day, I don't think he even remembers exactly how long. Yeah, there you are, I can hear him. He's part of the institution, but it's a tremendously important witness, because the Parliamentary Office is working across party political divides with various parties, and I think that's an important contribution. Obviously not taking sides with any one or other party. Also engaged, I haven't done the research that Terry did as far as Professor Gumede is concerned to check on all the things that Peter John has done, but he has engaged speakers and presenters from political organizations, from civil society organizations internationally and nationally, getting people to talk to one another and helping to bring down those barriers that exist across the divide in our country. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Father Peter John. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Alison, and it's a joy to be with you again, having had the privilege of doing this just before COVID. And I want to come at it today. I mean, it would be fairly easy and probably reasonably interesting to look at some of the real pathologies in our body politic and try and understand the specificity of it, try and look at its origins and try and work out strategies to reverse what is wrong, to build up what has been broken down. But I want to come at it slightly differently, wearing, as I was asked, more my theological cap at the broader area that I think embeds so many of those social pathologies. Can't make blanket statements, but that embed so many of those social pathologies. And that has been the crisis, and Professor Gumede referred to it several times, the crisis in leadership, the crisis that emerges from bringing those unresolved areas of trauma, of all the other vices that so often lurk unexamined in our thinking and in our responses to things, and bringing that into leadership and the huge sense of betrayal that many feel around leadership. And it's not only leadership in politics, even if that's the focus today. It's the leadership in the church, it's the leadership in the corporate structures, and it's the leadership, it's male leadership that has to be critiqued. So it's across the board, but I'm trying to engage it somewhat from our theological perspective, leadership as a theological issue to deal with if we are going to offer hope to those who are firstly to ourselves and to those who are part of our journey. I want to start at a place which is probably not unusual for people who work in the public space and work as theologians in the public space. I have been grappling for a long time to try and find a place in our foundational literature, especially in the New Testament, that could begin to offer a basis for our reflection. And I've slowly started to weave my thoughts together around that incident that is found in all three of the synoptic gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the fact that they found in all three already carries an importance. I want to look at it in Mark, and it's the story you will recall of Jesus engaging a particular space in a house, is surrounded by the leaders of the community. We're told explicitly the rabbis and the teachers of the law, and a paralytic, cannot get into that transformational space. Somebody who's been wounded, who's marginalized, is on a stretcher, who is on the peripheries of the society, who he cannot get into the transformative space because it's crowded out by all these institutional representatives. It's crowded out by the doctors of the law. It's crowded out by people who are engaging, and we see it in Mark, people who are engaging in a narrowly defined theological debate all around self-interest and how they can defend the institution. And that space, which was meant to be a transformative space for those on the margins, on the edges, for the wounded, the maimed, of any description, those people can't find a way into that transformative space because it's been closed by the narrow interests of the religious elite. And I think that does give us a working basis from which to look at some of our own responses to the crises of our times in our own country, specifically in the region, as we were reminded, and across the globe, where the common denominator that's emerging in our times is that of a deeply fractured and wounded world where the majority of people, like the man in our biblical story, are broken in some way or the other. And it strikes me that it is also a good starting point because it can be argued in our country, as in other places, that the space that had been opened up for transformation has in fact been occupied by self-interest, by institutional determination, by trying to keep those structures from which we benefit going for our benefit, and the poor are left on the rooftop. The rooftop, of course, in biblical architectural terms, is a marginal space. And so I see in that story something for us to work with in our own theological thinking, in our desire to forge ahead with a project of hope, to look for a starting point. And I think that offers one, probably of many, but it offers one for me that allows me to think beyond that. I think the second point I find in that story is not just the kinds of analysis of the spaces for transformation and how they've been hijacked, captured, so to speak, but also the fact that the those on the roof, those who think about ways of getting the poor, the marginalized man into the transformation space, into a place where he can begin to recover both his dignity and his agency, to the degree that those are not the same thing, where he can begin to find it. And it's those people who form with him on the margins, on the roof, a critical solidarity, so that a different way can be found to reaccess his dream of being in the transformative space. And so we find in that story the energy from the margins and not from the traditional focus of power or the locus of power becomes the energy that transforms and heals that man. And then as a third point, which I think has relevance for us in thinking theologically, how we're going to frame our movement forward, how we're going to frame taking our narrative to a new space, is the fact that we're told he picks up his bed and walks away. In other words, and it's a phrase Professor Gumede used several times, he regains his total agency. He now stands, as it were, on his feet, which biblically implies he has a different perspective. His worth is restored, his dignity is restored, he regains his agency. And we read, along with the latest story of Bartimaeus, which is another parallel story to this, the blind man, it allows both of them to put their begging bowls aside, to put their status as beggars, as people who are dependent. It allows them to put it aside. And they regain their dignity. Two kinds of leadership emerge. The one that suffocates the space of transformation, and the one that looks at it differently, that sees the closed door and looks for another way in solidarity from the margins of opening a way into that space and beginning to do things differently and leading into a place of transformation where agency is restored. I think it's interesting. It's interesting that the very next line after the story in Mark's gospel is the story, you will recall, of Matthew, Levi, as he's sometimes called, being told to get up from his place at the tax collector's table. So two people are engaging the power system. The one finds a way through the obstacles and reclaims the transformation space. The other is told to leave that behind, to move away from the political complexities, from the narrow polarities of the tax world, which was probably one of the most pernicious and corrupt institutions of the Roman Empire, stealing from the poor to enrich the elites. And Matthew Mark says, move beyond that. That paradigm of subservience in order to serve the rich is not one that's going to be helpful for you. And we know in our country the litany of social, moral, and economic pathologies. We know it only too well, and we could dwell on it for hours, and in other circumstances that would be appropriate. They are, every one of them, a blight on our country and a yoke around our necks. And I want however to begin to think about metaphors that aren't linked too narrowly to the specifics, but are rooted in our realities and begin to feed our imaginations to allow us important blue sky thinking, that the blue sky thinking can emerge. The ethicist Maureen O'Connell uses the metaphor of imprisonment and speaks about being imprisoned by our past. Interesting, again, a parallel with what Professor Gumede said, and she's talking about, as in her case, the history of racism. She talks about being hermetically sealed by 4 walls. And she asks us to examine in our quest for hope, in our quest to give leadership moving forward. She says, what are the 4 walls that we need to examine, especially in racialized societies? The first, she says, is the wall of segregation and isolation as a result of centuries of isolation through all the systemic forms of racism, class privilege, access to privilege, and the like. The second wall that imprisons us, she said, is the wall of amnesia. The amnesia about our history, the amnesia about our benefits and so forth. The third wall, she says, is the wall of illusions. The illusions about our own innocence and the delusions about the magnitude of injustice that we are the beneficiaries of or not. Especially things like the privileged pigmentation, proximity to power, or anything that privileges us. And finally, she says, we've got to look in our quest to explore the places that might be a suffocating hope from emerging: segregation and isolation, the wall of amnesia, the wall of illusions. She says the wall of privilege and power, the gifts that come to us by virtue of being part of a dominant group. And we see it clearly as it operates in society. The presumption of innocence, the amplified voices that we use, unquestioned belonging. And Maureen O'Connell says that these, if we're going to move forward, and I use it in conjunction with the story of the paralyzed man who couldn't get in via the gaps in the wall, has to come in from a different entry point, but has to begin to critique and question those 4 walls if we are going to move on. And I suspect I might be talking into the language of Professor Gumede when he speaks so eloquently about trauma and the quest to deal with trauma and the quest to allow trauma to find a place of resolution in us so that we can move forward. I want to suggest that perhaps adding to that, those 4 walls are critical for us to examine if we are going to find a space of hope. And she uses that lovely phrase that justice requires that we more fully know our histories, that we engage in structural analysis of social problems, that that we think with an imagination unfettered by the status quo, and that we privilege those closest to the pain with leading the way. I think that's quite a helpful thought. I want to just, in the few in the minutes that are left to me, also ask questions about what are the, and it links again to the story of the men, and that I'm not sure if they were men, but it would have made some kind of cultural anthropological sense to suppose that they were just men on the roof, lowering the paralytic into that space. In a way, they had to find what we have to find exactly in this moment of our history. They had to find a way of breaking what seemed to the naked eye to be a total impasse. They had to find a way of breaking an impasse. They had to reach deep into their box of diagnostic tools, if you like. And that, I think, is a huge part of the territory that we are challenged to enter at this point in providing theological support, theological accompaniment, as we recognized in that opening prayer, for the process of taking our liberation forward, of moving beyond some of the pathologies, and so forging hope. I want to suggest that in a deeply polarized society such as ours, where virtually every conversation about the neuralgic issues is contested, it is mostly embedded in suspicion. Why is she asking? What's he getting at? Are they blaming me? And I read earlier, no, not earlier, I read probably at the beginning of lockdown, Trevor Noah's memoirs, his autobiography. And he tells of how when he was newly arrived from this country in the United States, whenever he asked questions, just what he thought were simple questions, trying to understand the profoundly complex context of the United States, people immediately assumed that he was blaming them for racism, for the Mason-Dixie line, for the assassination of JFK, for the war in Iraq, and they became angry or defensive or both, when all he was trying to do was to find out about their history so that he could ask the appropriate questions in his show. Every conversation, most interactions are layered with suspicions, he concludes. Theologians talk about the hermeneutic of suspicion, and I find it an important tool in my trade, so to speak, because in polarized situations, it is our leadership responsibility to go into conversations knowing where suspicions are embedded and acknowledging that, so as to better navigate a way through the spaces in between what is said, so as to responsibly take the conversation to a less polarized place. The alternate is to stay stuck in a toxic narrative and in toxic attitudes. Responsible people, I want to say, have to, without denying the past, without trying to moderate the past, we have an obligation to take to detox conversations and attitudes which perpetrate worst case practices. And one of the things we often ignore is how this continuing silence on our part around toxic conversations increases trauma. Rebecca Solnit, who curiously I was just reading recently, a wonderful book called Orwell's Roses, because I, who appreciated Orwell greatly as a writer and author, a socialist, was also a great grower of roses and loved cultivating roses. And so she's been in my mind recently. She says, trauma is inherited silence, a silence it takes generations to hear. My second tool, firstly dealing with suspicions. My second tool is to look, flowing from that toolkit that got the man into a place where he could break the impasse, is looking at the attitudes and the culture of entitlement. In South Africa, at a crude level, it's almost always, either consciously or unconsciously, it's always associated with a caricature of greedy blacks laying claim to what they didn't work for or don't deserve. But as with all caricatures, it's more unsettling than that. It is also about often unexamined entitlement of dominant groups to the confidence, the assertiveness, the possessions that those groups feel entitled to by virtue of their dominance, their facility with language. And all of those things, all of those dimensions are also insidious in our body politic. It crosses all sorts of platforms. One of the despicable, I mean, we just know it. And we in the church have been reminded, if I can just go on a little diversion, we in the church have been reminded of that so regularly and robustly recently by Francis's confrontation of the notion of clericalism, just how we how we construct special status in order to serve power and the need to disrupt that power. I often think, and I'll come back to where I was a moment ago, of Cornel West's insightful comment that justice is love in the political realm. And I believe that in the world of entitlement and power, I believe that as leaders, we have the responsibility to disrupt narratives and practices of entitlement, just as those men did for the paralytic. One of our greatest contributions at this time is to have a new reference point for our conversations. And then finally, I think it should be about, it's finally time. The third tool that I use in my work, and that I try and sharpen theologically, so that it can, we all have the responsibility to let our privately held beliefs have public significance. And so these three diagnostic tools are part of the public significance that I think flows from our privately held beliefs. I think the third tool that we need to engage with is the deep caution and the felt anxiety around what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. We live in a society and an era where evil is ordinary, when wrongdoing and theft and the further marginalization of the poor is normalized. And that's a frightening experience. One has to only look at the language, and I don't want to go off on another tangent now, but one has to only look and analyze the language used with regard to migrants and refugees. Suella Braverman was critiqued recently by a Holocaust survivor for using language in England. Suella Braverman is a cabinet minister in England. That the questioner said was the language that led to the belittling of people's dignity and ultimately, or the disregard of people's dignity and ultimately the Holocaust. So there is, and one doesn't have to go far. We look at it here, we look at the rhetoric coming from the Dudula, we look at the rhetoric coming from some political parties about the exclusion of children from schooling, and if their parents don't have documentation, despite the fact that court rulings and the Constitution say differently. We just need to look at how we've demonized some of these discussions, but how banal we've allowed evil to become. And so with that in mind, let me just allow me to comment on those men who lowered the paralytic through the roof in the light of those 3 diagnostic tools. They got involved in the messiness of that situation. They got involved in the messiness of that man's life. James Keenan says that mercy is the willingness to enter into the chaos of another, to move towards each other rather than retreat. But they are also witnesses to each other's graciousness and their collective mercy and creativity. In their action, very powerfully, mercy and witness come together. This is the counterpoint to normalizing evil. It disrupts its hegemony. Witness is a word with layers of theological significance. A witness does not simply offer some kind of a factual testimony about an event they've observed from the margins. Rather, a witness shares knowledge they have accumulated from encountering an event or significant moment in a fully embodied way. This isn't just any kind of knowledge either, but rather it often contains countercultural ideas and radical perspectives with the potential to transform those who share in it and those who take it in. Witnesses often impart a dangerous wisdom, which is why the word martyr comes from the Greek martes, meaning a witness. The opposite of the banality of evil must lie somewhere in the realm of truth-telling. To speak truthfully about what we have seen, heard, or experienced in the past allows us, as again Professor Gumadi said, to live differently in the present, and living differently in the present, we can also make a different future possible. We are custodians of all of those futures. I love the line of Marcel Proust, who says, the real voyage of discovery lies not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. I think that's part of what we as leadership in the faith-based communities need to recontemplate, having new eyes, so that we can move towards new landscapes. I trust that we will begin in our time to allow that to happen, because it is undoubtedly our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter John. I guess the people on Zoom also smiled in between, but the people who are here in person where I am certainly enjoyed some of the comments you had to make in between the more serious ones. Thank you very much. And now we come to a conversation between Professor Gumede and Father Peter John, and the technical person here will say, how we have to sit. You must come back here. Okay. And I must move this. Even closer. Okay.
And do I need a mic?
Guess this. And what about
A mic? No?
No, that will do for you.
Oh, there we go.
Do for both of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm in a position where I can't see Father Peter John. I know he's still there. I'm
I
sitting
am.
next. It's a bit weird, you know, this disembodied voice coming across the Hottentots Holland Mountains from another country. So I can't see you. I'm going to ask you, perhaps, Peter John, to kick off with something you would like to respond to of what Professor William had to say. And then when you don't go on too long, because it's a conversation, and remember, I can't see you.
Okay. I mean, imagine asking a preacher not to go on too long. I mean, how does that work? Professor Gumede, thank you. That was a real tour de force, and I've taken copious notes. So thank you once again for those insights. I saw a few overlaps in what we had to say, and I think I would really like to explore at least one of them. I was intrigued, partly because I'm struggling to think about it. I was intrigued by how you offered us a very powerful insight around not ignoring our past, not leaving the past out of the way we shape the future, but not being trapped by it, or not allowing, as I understood it, that to be the only determinant in going forward. I see it as the kind of language of the impasse that I used. Could we begin to converse around a polarized position we have in this country, where if you don't support a particular line, you're denying the legitimacy of the anti-apartheid struggle, and you are sinking into reactionary rhetoric. And that kind of loyalty doesn't allow us to move. I'd value your insights further.
Thank you so much, and I've enjoyed really your presentation. I've learned quite a bit, and you include sort of my favorite writers, Rebecca Solnit, who I absolutely love. Yes, unfortunately, what we need imagination really is around being stuck in the past and and I think most of you put it so much better. Really, the polarization around where our society is so strongly polarized, or around suspicions linked to the past, that we cannot talk about a present in a constructive, in a practical, in a pragmatic, and an imaginative way. So we have to find to get out of it. I mean, I've done just some separately. So Democracy Works Foundation, what we've done, or the team, it's not, I haven't done it, but our very young team has looked at social media responses on our really critical issues on a day by day. So social media really has been, there's supposedly what is called Black Twitter, which on a day, sort of the trending issues. And they looked at how current issues on a day-to-day, the responses from young people today, young people, we say sort of under 30 or under 35, is very much based on the past. Everything is based on the past. So every solution is so strongly based on the past. And I mean, these are young people, so we're not talking about those who've experienced the past. And so on. So it's a fundamental blockage. I mean, just if you look at I mean, I have navigated into social media, and it's been run by a team, by a young team. So not necessarily me, but occasionally I kind of pop in to see, and so on. And a lot of the younger responses, which I find on some of the things I write, is really, really based, actually, it's fixed on the past. So we can have to find a way of getting our headspace somehow out of the past, because the past is really fixed our headspace, but in a way we look at other people. And how do we get out of that in order to get pragmatic solutions for the future? And obviously, I mean, I am part of the past, and I've lived the past in a really traumatic way. But unless even at an individual level, one can imagine oneself out of that, it will become very difficult. And that really is my worry. Even if we take it out of politics and just in the decisions, just think about how the past limits people, where on intimate choices on intimate relationships, if it's so based on the past, how it limits people. So it means individual will only go out with people from his or her community or into the village. It's as simple as that. It's not even color or any, how the limitations, how the past limits one, or even something like career choices if one is young. How it is limited to the past, or I mean, there are many the sort of things. So we really will have to have this sort of debate, but maybe also, lastly, just in terms of that, proposals from certain people in the public will be rejected not on its merits, but based on how people are viewed. Somehow. So that undermines our debate and the quality of our debate and the quality of solutions in the country. And maybe something which I have increasingly been thinking, and just think about it, in the apartheid era, there was a white poverty problem, and there was a lot of engagement and policy discussions during the apartheid era on how to deal with poor whites. So, but many people in contemporary South Africa don't even want to look at some of those solutions to see if some of that is actually relevant for our times now. Is there something we could use? And so on, because, it's untouchable. We don't even want to look at it. Even as simple, well, it's not simple, because it really is, the technical schools, the agriculture schools, the artisan sort of things that's during the apartheid era, which is absolutely crucial for this economy. I cannot tell you from an economy point of view how societies that get out of poverty, they really build on the technical side. They build careers on the technical, on the artisan, plumbers, electricians. That is really crucial for a society. I mean, it's not just being at university, we were like superfluous at a university, but how that system, because it's been associated with the apartheid government, is not found acceptable right now in our society.
Thank you for that. Is there something you want to say to Peter John in terms of something that he had to say in his talk?
Really, I mean, what I've been trying to, challenging the theologians to begin to, engage in, from how do we respond at a level of spiritual, because we, as a country, we also are, part of the trauma, and I didn't deal with it, what it does is spiritual poverty. comes out of yeah. So I'll unpack it. What do you mean? Either people, if you look at what's happening in the country, either the extremes of people hold on to sort of, let's call it fundamentalist religion in a way to support them. I mean, if people have a legitimate, obvious needs, spiritual needs, where what we see in society more and more of the embrace of really harmful spiritual practices, because the mainstream progressive spiritual community are not relating to our contemporary times. I mean, the thing about trauma, what trauma does, it unleashes some existential insecurity among the victims of the past. I mean, also also among whites, because their world is also upside down. If you were a white South African, suddenly your world that you grew up of the past is not relevant, and the same for Blacks, their world. So we've got two communities that actually, it's almost of chaos at the soul level, of a displacement as a sense of self, who we are. Who are we at the soul level, and how do we respond to that from a spiritual level? Obviously, I mean, I've been trying to look at it initially at the intellectual level, to say, let's embrace different kinds of politics and more inclusion and so on. But I think the challenge is, how do we actually have a progressive spiritual response to this existential, I mean, I don't have any other word to use, but existential insecurity, this displacement of self, this the anxiety at the soul level.
Okay, Peter John.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think the whole area of emotional, psychological, spiritual dislocation is one of the biggest problems facing people who work in pastoral realities. And so I want to acknowledge that what you say is what I think many of us find in pastoral situations. I think you also point correctly to the fact that in the quest to fill that space, we tend to do in spirituality what we do sometimes in the world of color and so forth, and that is to go for absolutes. So we find that the answer is to go into worship spaces that proclaim very unambiguous absolutes. Everything is either or, black or white, whatever the firm dividing lines are. And that robs us, in the same way as you spoke about being robbed of our agency and responsibility, that robs us of the necessary nuances that we need in order to speak to our situations today, which are complex situations. And part of why I think we often don't find the same kind of flows into the traditional progressive churches, or is that we don't come in and say, this is it, this way or that way, but we tend to try and understand that empowerment and agency comes from dealing with the nuances. And that's a hard pastoral reality to engage in, but it's a fulfilling one. So I'm agreeing with you and saying that part of that is finding spiritualities that allow for nuance, that allow for new ideas to emerge, that allow for the sciences, especially the social sciences, to contribute to our way of understanding. And I think that's the spirituality, and it crosses, in your words, it crosses denominational and even faith boundaries. It is as common to Judaism as to Islam, as to Baha'ism, as to Christianity, and many more. And I think that's where we've got to look for the nuances that we share as we try and allow our understanding of faith to be something that nurtures us, that takes us beyond the crass kinds of things we've inherited into a more liberated humanity. Irenaeus of the 2nd century spoke very powerfully of the glory of God is a person fully human. And I think that still remains the goal and the goal of pastoral realities and spiritual fulfillment. So I agree totally, but I do think that rushing to religions that are absolutist, in fact, just continues the past. And you know, we need to look for the more nuanced and life-giving kinds of sources of spirituality.
Okay, thank you for that. Would you like to have one more word in terms of the conversation before you have to go? Professor William, no, you're okay. Peter John, a last word?
I have many last words. You know, it's like preaching.
Just choose
and you say,
one.
finally, finally, finally. I think I really, really want us to continue to engage a far more intentionally interdisciplinary kind of work. You know, we do need the social sciences, for instance. We need science, we need theology, we need spirituality, we need these various ologies to begin to speak to each other, to mold something that provides a good sense of the future, and that it isn't left to those like most of us around the room and Zoom today, who are very privileged, who can link beautiful things in cosmology with spirituality and understand you know, Mozart but we need a kind of democratization of the future and of the beauty of religion. I think one of the next struggles we're going to have in theology is around reassessing and taking notions like wonder and integrity and beauty and finding their political resonances in our society. So that's my last word.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of all the people who are attending either on Zoom or here in person, I want to say thank you very much to both our speakers. You've given us plenty to think about. We're going to take a short break now. And when we resume, we ourselves, wherever we are, will be in groups. And our technical support team here will put you in a group if you are somewhere floating around in cyberspace. So when you come back, you will find yourself in a group. So thank you very much. Time for a quick break.
Thank you.
And we'll take, I think we'll take 15 minutes from now. So that brings us to 20 past. Thank you. Thank you. We really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
About what we heard from the two speakers, what we ourselves think, what we ourselves are committed to doing, to making a difference, about bringing hope in our society. So over to you in the small groups, and we'll call you back in about 20 minutes. Okay, now the same here. Are we off offline?
No.
Okay, I invite everybody back into the big group, whether you are online or whether you are physically present. because we're now going to hear from the different groups any aspect of what we heard that they would like to stress or emphasize, any questions they'd like to raise, so that we can take this discussion a little bit further forward. So those of you who are online, please indicate, or maybe Father Martin will just, because Father Martin is doing the technical side, maybe he will just call out one group after another so that we give everybody a chance. That's probably the easiest.
Maybe invite who wants to speak first, Alison.
Oh, okay. Can they put up their hand? Okay. If you are from a particular group and you would like to report back, or if you were designated to report back, please indicate by means of the little hand on Zoom that you would like to talk. Otherwise, we'll do a random selection and jump on people.
There we are. Cananero.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cananero.
Thank you, Father. I hope you can hear me. I think there was a bit of confusion in our group. We thought that would get the instruction in the group, so not much discussions happened. But if I may ask my question, please, particularly with the first presentation that happened with Professor Gumede. I think a lot of conversations that have been happening, starting with my head and then people around me and people who are keen on listening, are around what Professor Gumede raised, which was quite refreshing, and I really liked it. I want to touch on the political landscape as well as voting in South Africa. So a lot of the times we talk about voter literacy and how we should teach people who vote and all of that. And I always feel that there's a certain aspect that we tend to forget out of that, which was raised this morning, which is the trauma. Apartheid was traumatic, was systematic, and very calculated. So post-apartheid era, what happened was now we have the new democracy, and we need to shift to the new democracy. But I feel what's missing is dealing with that trauma. So where do we find ourselves? My observation is that we now find ourselves in a situation where people who lived through apartheid, some of them might have passed on, some of them are still living now. They're raising children with that mentality, and they're raising their children with that mentality, and we're not breaking that cycle. So hence you would get what was raised by Professor Gumede, hence you would get young people on social media, on Black Twitter, talking, using language that you wouldn't expect from the young generation, given that some of them might not even have been born there. Why is that? It's because they're being raised by people who were born in apartheid. I'm getting to my question just now. So I feel that it's important to first acknowledge that, right? And when we talk voter literacy, for me, it's too high a grade. We're not talking about the root cause. Why do we have what we call blind loyalty? Why do we have people still voting? And you look at the situation and it's like, how can't they see? Let's look into the future. The reason for me, and it's my observation, it's because of that. We haven't dealt with that trauma. So my question is, how best can we deal with the trauma? Firstly, acknowledge that there was trauma suffered on both sides. And I'll be very simplified in saying both black and white, but obviously there are other races there. There was trauma suffered both sides, right? But how do we actually deal with that before we can start talking about voter literacy? On a separate note, I really appreciate these type of sessions because I feel this is where we can honestly share our views, share our opinions in a very safe space. So thank you very much for always having these family days as Dominicans. Thank you.
Someone else?
Sorry, you just start again, Alison.
Oh, sorry. I want to say thank you very much, Kananelo, for your contribution. You've raised an important question, which I won't tackle directly, but it may come as an answer from, or an answer may come from somebody else's comment. Terry?
Thanks, Kani. That was very articulate, and we also love having you in our family and in our sphere, and thank you for being online. Professor Gumede had to go back to a retreat that he had left in order to join us. And I want to underscore what he said as a response to that transgenerational trauma that our communities are living with. And the one thing is to work with self-love and work from a compassionate and loving space, and also to generate experiences of social agency. So those are the three pillars that he spoke about, and he's still working on them and thinking of it and teasing it out. And what his thinking, his next project is going to be, is looking at spiritual democracy, which brings those two aspects of our lives together.
Okay, somebody else want to say something?
If nobody online, yeah. Shall we take it from the room then?
I think so.
Speak at the lights. And then you can just pass it around.
One of the things that struck me was the part that Father Peter John said, that there are two kinds of leadership. The type that suffocates and the type that opens doors and leads to places where agency is restored. And I was very struck, although I've looked at that parable often, about how other people were needed to open up the roof and let the paralytic down. In other words, it wasn't all his own doing. He was assisted. But you need to have a group that feels the same and can share with you and empower you to do that kind of thing. He also spoke, and this part he went through quite quickly, so I didn't get it properly, but about the four walls and how we have to open them up. Segregation was one. Amnesia, which I think is often a very convenient tool. Illusion. And we need to explore places that facilitate the above. But I would like to work more on those. And he did speak about knowing your own history. And I think that whole thing of how attitudes are transferred from one generation to the next, almost as if you don't know they're moving. Even if you're raised in a wealthy home, you still grow up with a mentality of scarcity. So I often think, I look at our Dominicans and think, are we still living in an attitude of scarcity, or are we moving outwards and embracing the wealth that exists?
Okay, the Montebello Convent, we'd like to hear from you.
Yes, thank you. We were also like the same group. We were waiting. We thought we would have instruction. Did you unmute me? Okay, we thought we were going to get the instruction, but then afterwards we then look at the few points from Professor Gumede. In actual fact, what was the key thing? Because he spoke about the trauma that holds us back to move to the future. And also stated the point that sometimes that trauma affects us in the decision-making that we have. Instead of looking to the future, we are held back. He even made an example of that some of us are still voting for old political parties who actually, at the present moment, they are not standing for what it's good for us as the people or as a country. and also spoke about the danger that even the young ones that were not there, the issue of the generation picking up what their parents or grandparents lived with, to think like them. And that was the challenge that we looked at, we are faced with, that we need to get a way of working together, more special as religious, because at the same time, these challenges that are there, because it's all about people thinking about themselves, more especially those in leadership, political leadership. We think that we have got challenges as religious to join together, because even Father, as he was speaking, he spoke about the issue of that trauma is inherited silently. So we have got this society that we have to join hands as religious, because we just discussions like this are giving us insight what we should join together and to work towards building a new society in order to have, I think it was Professor Komeda who spoke about the new moral ways of doing things, because we don't have those new moral ways of doing things. We are still stuck in an old one. We think for us as religious is for us to go out there and join together hands to see how are we going to contribute in building up these new moral ways of doing things, especially in our country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone from here?
Sister Stephanie?
We were looking at the whole aspect of trauma and its effect on us. We can have therapy, we can have help, but there's still scars that remain behind. And in a sense, what we were saying is that, well, there could be scars, but there could be, it could cripple. Our trauma can cripple us. And to be able to acknowledge the damage that was done, but not to allow it to stop us from moving forward. In fact, I mean, the group didn't say this, but I think that having experienced trauma, we become the wounded healers. We understand trauma. And doing that, we can perhaps recognize it and then be of help, not to suppress it, but to try and understand it. And then the other thing that was raised in our group was a hope, a possibility of collaboration between people who, Dominicans, to deal with the trauma within our congregations, to find ways to come to healing and to deal with trauma.
Thank you. Anybody else? Either on, oh yes, there's another one, Sister Margaret.
I was just struck very much by the professor's words on trauma and on violence. It's as if the two grew up together. Here comes trauma and the solution is violence. And that carried on cycle after cycle after cycle. And what I see in front of me in the township of Leyte is, or the informal settlement is, gangs who perpetuate the violence are now used to curb the violence that's going on when robberies take place. In other words, they turn to these gangs to get hold of the robbers to teach them a lesson. And although it seems like an immediate solution to a horrible problem, now the gangs are, made proud of. So, it's all going astray at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Is that it? Okay. Do you want something?
Portrait Wildfire eats us, I have here. But you're welcome.
Fortune Ship, you're welcome.
They've disappeared.
Oh, okay. We're just double checking to make sure that we've caught everybody.
Are we back?
Yes.
Hello, we're back.
Good. We can hear
We
you.
can see you and hear you.
Hello, I'm confused by the fortune ship. Sorry, that's the computer giving us that name, but it's Mili Majola who's speaking now. I was also in group 1. We are 2 here attending together with SNSC Kuzwayo. We're in group 1. Unfortunately, in our group, we all didn't know the question of discussion. We ended up not getting the line of discussion, but then we want to comment on the talk that we attended from my father and Professor Kumede. I personally was intrigued by Father Peter John's reflection on the story of Jesus with that, where the man broke the lines of communications that were the norm of the time, getting on top of the roof so as to get attention. I think as Dominicans, we are called to do that. Reading the signs of the time, as Professor Kumete gave us a reflection on that, the governance in our country, the lack in the voters' education. We as Dominicans, I think we are called now to do the same, to find ways, like Father said, we need to have diagnostic tools which will implement the spirituality of mercy and witness, because that's what those men did when they tried to get through to Jesus. So we are also called as preachers, as people of praise, and as blessers to try and get new ways, new spirituality that will take us through to justice, since justice is also one of our strength and one of our mission, justice and peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, that seemed, is there another one? Anybody else?
It's back. Carry on.
We've now entered load shedding, but because of an inverter, we're still here.
We had, our group had mainly questions about how we very much liked the talk, and thank the team, Stephanie and the 4 of you, for arranging this. We feel it's helpful, but we sometimes feel at a loss as how we can respond. We did say we each need to do our part. We need to try and see with new eyes. We also like the idea of finding a way to do what we know has to be done, like the men on the roof. But I personally was just remembering what Judy shared at the beginning, doing our own part, however small that might seem, can make a difference to the whole and will make a difference to the whole. That we each need to do what we can see in trying to live community, in trying to heal our own trauma, because we have it strong. We have it on 2 fronts, all of us in this room, both the colonialization and the racism. It's and the way religious life has changed, has knocked taken the floor from under our feet. And we've experienced heavy trauma, and we need not to act out of that, but really put on a new mind, new eyes, like they were saying. You know, that's what we need. But what Judy shared gave me hope for all of us that there are things we can do. They aren't tremendous, they're small, but I think Martin said the same. All we need to do is our bit. And I think that the talks have helped us and encouraged us to want to do that. We spoke in our little group, we spoke about Gregory Boyle and what he does for the gangs. It's amazing what difference one person can make if they put their mind and their heart and their soul to it.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, Martin's looking to see if there's anyone else online who still wants to say something. Well, that brings us to the end of the formal part of the program around governance and everything that we've been talking about. And we want to, again, in their absence, say thank you to those who were gracious enough to accept the invitation to be present. We want to thank everybody who's been present and participated, and encourage you all to do your part in whatever small way that may be. And we can all do that. And then we will move to Dominicans only section of this program. And we will be inviting people to share some news that they would like to share from their congregations. Thank you. That's fine. Okay, so we'll do the same thing this way. If you would indicate by a show of hands or online that you would like to share something from your congregation or about Dominican life or an event or anything that you would like other people to know about. So please indicate. Watch everybody rush. Do we have to jump on people, like to ask Sister Mary Tuck to give us something about the King sisters?
I'd rather give you something about the DSA. That's Dominican Sisters Africa. There's going to be an assembly starting on the 30th of June, and it's carrying on until the 5th of July. And we are really trying hard to get our sisters together all over Africa. So I've also been asked to ask, is anybody interested? Obviously the leaders are invited, and we'd like the leaders to take someone that would make herself available for an office. For example, Sister Venencia, she's a Montebello sister. She's the coordinator for Africa, and I'm the Justice and Peace promoter. So I get to meet with the international group, which has been extremely broadening and amazing. I've loved that. And also at the UN with Dusty. So we're for the whole of Africa. And then the country or the continent is divided into 4, and they're different zones. And so we're trying to work more with the English-speaking zone. The other one is French. But we'd love to get something going, some more collaboration. We find it extremely difficult. I know the situation in countries is difficult, but trying to get other Dominicans that we stand together and lend our voice to something. So we're asking Alison and Stephanie and the others, Tobile, will you be going to the assembly at the end of June in Nairobi? And could you bring 1 or 2 sisters along that would be prepared to stand for an office? I think for us Kings, you know, I think there's so many of us Kings, I feel like you all know this.
You're talking to the rest of us as well.
So we have a leadership team of 4, and this time we chose to let 2 of the sisters stay in Germany, and the 2, Sylvia and myself, live here in South Africa. So last year in August, we actually went to Germany to set ourselves up as a team. And now on Tuesday, they'll be coming to South Africa, Francesca and Veronica. So we'd love to meet with more Dominicans so that they really get a sense of our lives here in South Africa. Does anybody else want to tell us anything? Newcastle, you okay?
Okay, thank you to Sister Mary. Now Sister Steph from Newcastle is giving us an update.
We will have 2 young people making final profession this year later on. They're both Vietnamese. One of them is in England already because she has passed the English exam, that is required to get a visa. The other one's English is not so good. So we've been having to think of different ways of getting the other Vietnamese sister from South Africa to England under a different visa system where she won't have to do the exam initially. She might have to do it 2 years later. And then we have 4 young people who will be making first profession next month, 2 Vietnamese and 2 South African. So.
Did you not want to tell us something about your chapter and who was elected?
Oh, right. Well, in the chapter, Sister Anne, who was a congregation prioress 6 years ago, was re-elected or was elected into office again. And then she will have 2 of the same people who were on the congregation council. That is the secretary, Sister Karen Datois, and who's a Canadian, and Sister Maria Tui, who's our one of our financial boffins. And then in addition, there's Sister Christina McGarry. She's a new person on the block. So yes, that's our new congregation council.
We have an online hand.
Okay. Do you know who that is?
This is our fortune ship again.
Oh, fortune ship. We're ready to hear from you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are all well. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think I'm very happy we are very happy to have this new name, Fortune Ship Wildfire. This is just a computer giving us a new name. We don't know why. This is a joyful sister. We call ourselves joyful sisters because we are lay Dominicans. So there's a prefix there for which we put, which is joyful, which has got a long explanation. Joyful sister Sane Kuzwayo. And I'm from the St. Rose of Lima, lay Dominicans of KZN. St. Rose of Lima, lay Dominicans of KZN. We are linked to both Montebello sisters as well as the friars at Mapetelu in Petermaritzburg. So I think that's enough introduction for now. To say who exactly I am. I'm actually Sanehi, because I'm not fortunate. I don't know, but it's a good thing because it's just got a fortune on it. And we're coming to the crux of the matter now.
Can I just interrupt you for a minute, please? Can I interrupt you? Can you repeat the last bit you said, because we didn't understand what you said. The connection was bad. Can you please repeat that last bit? The collaboration, whatever you said after the collaboration.
Oh, I don't know which part did you miss, but I just said I'm from the St. Rose of Lima, KZN. And then we are linked to Montebello sisters and the friars, the Dominican friars, which are based in Mozambique at Mapetelu.
Okay, and then?
So the crux of the matter, as I was listening, thank you very much for the morning input. It was very informative and educational indeed. As I was listening, as we were listening, we gained a lot. But I just want to come up with something completely different, which I've always been observing from my chapter, which is the St. Rose of Lima. It's a beautiful chapter. We love it. We love being there. I love being there. We have grown. We are all growing. There's this phase which is an ongoing, because it's ongoing, when getting taught, it's an ongoing formation, so to speak. So it's a good place to be. is that we are different from different walks of life, and now I find that many of us are Zulu speakers. Actually, the majority of us are Zulu speakers, to be quite honest. And the challenge that we observe is that when it is time, when we meet perhaps once a month or whenever we meet, there's this challenge which one picks up of when we play an office, when we play the office in English, you find that there is no office in isiZulu. I don't know whether there are other offices in other vernacular languages. The sisters of Montebello would perhaps might have to respond to this now before we part. I don't know, but maybe later, because they have our details in our contact. And the challenge is it's so difficult to observe because a lot of people do not really know how to pray the office, which goes to show that in their various areas where they live their everyday life, where they live their everyday life, perhaps they don't have access to the know-how of praying the office. And in this, this opportunity in this meeting to request from all corners of the world, wherever you are, you are welcome to write in English because we are constant to it, to perhaps supply us or offer us or acquaint us with some information, methods, and ways of how we, as the ones who are a bit enlightened, we could assist to teach those that are not so fortunate how to play an office. That's what I'm saying. I've just said earlier on, the sisters of Montebello might come in, but it's better to just bring this thing onto this broader spectrum so that we get more ideas. I don't know how could you, whether one could just leave the email address or the WhatsApp number where you could just assist us with.
Okay. Can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
We'll ask Sister Tobile to respond to you, and if not immediately, as soon as possible after this. Your line is very poor. We are struggling to hear you. And so, Sister Tobile, will you take up the request from the lay Dominicans, please? Cananelo.
Sorry,
Thank you
there's
very
a
much.
final point. Hello, sorry. There was a final point I wanted to make. Just one point this time. I hope you can hear me.
Quickly. Cananelo.
Okay, thank you, sister. So I am an associated to the King William Town Dominican Sisters. And I just wanted to share, I won't be talking about the final vows and all of that, but I just wanted to share one of the many things I do is I work closely with Radio Veritas. I help them out there quite a lot. And towards the end of last year, we introduced a new program called A World of Prayer. And it's a program that's presented by Father Martin Badenhorst. And it's a program that has received a lot of love, and new listeners have been gained through that program. We'll also have it on different mediums over and above Radio Veritas within this first quarter. So I just wanted to encourage you, if you haven't yet listened to it, to please just check it out. It is on Wednesday afternoons between 1 and 2. Thank you.
Anybody else got Tobile? Sister Tobile?
Yes, Alison. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Sister Tobile, Montebello Dominican. First, I would respond to Mary Tag, since she talked about the assembly. So I would respond that Sister Mary Tag, the Montebello Dominican, will be represented in that assembly in Kenya. So two of us will show our faces there. We assure you. And we also had our chapter in October. We had two chapters, the chapter of affairs and the elective chapter. We had the chapter of affairs in October and the chapter of election in December. And I was re-elected, and Sister Jerome, because she belongs to the old council, she was also re-elected as a council member. And our vicar is Sister Valentine. And then the other council member is Sister Ethel and Sister Mavis. So we continue asking your prayers to continue pray for us as the new leadership of Montebello. We thank you. The chapter went well. Thanks for your prayers. I asked you to pray for us, and you really prayed because the chapter went well. We are happy. And as Montebello Dominican sisters, we also in our chapter we had a resolution, and then we said we wanted to focus on the Laudato Si. We know that the document from Pope Francis, we know that the Laudato Si is related to justice and peace and integrity. So justice and peace is also the important element of the Dominican family. So as Montebello, we want to be engaged on that. So we hope that our wish will be successful, and then we can do something concerning with Laudato Si. And also we had the celebration, the annual celebration, and we are grateful that the Dominican family were represented there. The Oxford were there, the King, the Newcastle. So we were happy, we were a good family. So the celebration went well. We had the first profession and also the jubilarians celebration. Thank you so much. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Sister Tobile.
Yes.
Thank you, Sister Tobile. You reminded me to announce that St. Augustine College is hosting Elizabeth Johnson online on the 15th of February at 6 o'clock. We did send out an invitation, and I have seen that it's gone out to a lot of people, but why you make me, Sister Tobile, to remember is that her whole talk is going to be around the work that she's been doing on what's come out of Laudato Si. So it's enfolding with, I don't remember what, but I think that I'm hoping that the Dominican community will spread it wide.
Thank you, Terry.
That's a mic drop, it's for me.
Anybody else online or in person who wants to give some kind of update or announcement or question? Anybody online there? No. Okay, so in that case, Mary, do you want to say a last word, or no? You're okay. All right. In that case, we thank you once again for having made the time, either from home or from St. Mary's in Johannesburg, to participate and to join the Dominican family. It doesn't seem possible for all of us to get together in person anymore because we kind of spread out, but this seems to have worked very well, apart from an odd little glitch here and there. But thank you, have a good week, and we'll see you next time. And thank you very much to Father Martin for providing the technical assistance. Without him, we wouldn't have been able to pull this off. Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Maybe we'll just say that, tell us about the month of the order.
Oh, but we've switched.
Just tell us.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
No, I mean, if it's going to be online for the Dominican community, I think it should be online for the Dominican community.
But they're probably gone now.
They're still there.
Oh, okay.
We're having as brethren, having our annual meeting at Laverna on the 7th and 8th of February this year. And we would hope to have Brother Jared, the Master of the Order, with us. At the moment, there is upheaval around visas, as there always are, and we hope to get that sorted out within the next week or so. If he has extra time, I don't know what his plans were. We'll see if we can make arrangements for him to be met by the broader Dominican family.
Yay! Let's speak to Brother Mike. I spoke to Mike Wale about it, and there would be a chance if we wanted to go. I mean, he's still arranging it, but there may be a chance for us to go to Mondial on Sunday afternoon. Is it the 6th? 5th or 6th? But so we're not sure, but that could be a possibility if we wanted to go for a bring and share tea or something.
Bring cakes.
We'll tell you. We'll let you know if it's possible. So we need to keep the brethren in our prayers. You're having your assembly as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.